The following program is seen statewide on California Public Television. Well, hello everybody, I'm Huell, and here we are on our state's northern coast in the nice little coastal community of Eureka. Now, we have come here to spend the afternoon at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park, which is located right up on the top of this bluff over here. Now, the park really isn't that big. It's only 20 acres in size. But they tell us there's a lot of very important and interesting California history up there. So if you're up for this adventure, as always, you're invited to spend the afternoon with us. An afternoon at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park, one of California's golden parks.
I love you, California. You're the greatest state of all. I love you in the winter, summer, spring, and in the fall.
Okay, here we are. We are ready to start our adventure. Our tour guide today, Edie, you are an interpreter with California State Parks, and we are here to tour this state park. And I got to tell you, we pulled up here and parked and looked out here, and basically we're talking about a big empty field with a couple of buildings on it, but I'm sure that there's some historical significance to all this, or it wouldn't be a state historic park.
Well, there certainly is, and we want to welcome you to Fort Humboldt State Historic Site. And as you can see, these two buildings here look like just a couple of buildings, but they have a lot of stories to tell. This fort was the most isolated outpost of its time back in the 1850s and 60s, and it represented sort of the hub of the civilization that started here on the north coast.
Okay, so it was established in the early 1850s, basically up here on this bluff, because we're looking out at part of Humboldt Bay out here, so obviously the location was important. Why was a fort needed out here in the middle of nowhere?
California gold. Gold had been discovered up in the Trinity Mountains. Humboldt Bay was discovered in 1850, and California became a state. Settlers came flooding in here for the gold. Of course, they realized later on that the real gold here was the redwood trees. But with all the settlers coming in, the Native American people who had lived here for thousands of years got pushed back into the forests and starved. So a conflict grew from that, and then the military was asked to come in and make a presence, settle the conflict, which they actually thought would happen in 2 years, and establish it so that this could be an area where everybody could live together in peace.
Now, was this a big fort? How big an area would the fort have covered?
This was a pretty small fort, because if you see the two large white buildings here, and then you see the flagpole, which is in the original position now that it was, you will also see some little posts over here that show where some of the other buildings were. So basically we had buildings in three sides of a square, sort of a horseshoe almost, with a parade ground area in the middle.
So it was all just right in here.
Just right in here, and these buildings on the bluff were not here. They were built after the fort was abandoned. So
okay,
the fort,
so these aren't original buildings
not
here.
At all.
These are original buildings over here.
These original buildings have been reconstructed. The buildings on the front were not here, and therefore they could look right across to the entrance to the harbor.
How many soldiers were here?
In the beginning, about 60 soldiers, and then they would have other troops come in, small camps and outposts would come up, and they would have sort of an influx, but usually between 60 and at the most 90 soldiers.
Was this the only game in town? Was this what was here then?
In the beginning, this was what was here. Now, there were a couple of small towns, the town of Bucksport right below the bluff, Eureka to our north, and a third town called Union, which today we know as Arcata. Those were the small towns that had started to grow up by the time the fort was established.
What happened to all these buildings? Did they just kind of fall down over the years?
Well, these soldiers arrived here and had to actually construct their own buildings. The redwood trees came much closer to the front of the bluff than they do now. They actually thought they were only going to be here a couple of years.
So they weren't building anything very substantial.
No. In fact, the hospital building, which we will be going into, that's our museum now, was actually reconstructed 10 years after it was originally built. And the fort was only here for 13 years with active troops. By the time it it was abandoned, most of the buildings, with the exception of the hospital building, had actually collapsed or were looted. Very little was left.
So the history of this fort is just really a snapshot in time.
It certainly is, and that's what is so compelling about this area, is how it changed so many lives in such a short period of time.
Right now we are standing here looking out at a small part of the bay, a bay which played a very important part in the history of what happened right here. Cheryl, you're representing the Wiyot people,
Yes.
and the Wiyot people were here long before this fort was. Tell us the story.
Yes, we're here. My father's people came from Eel River, which was called Wiyot. My mother's people came from the bay, which is called Weegi. And before Humboldt Bay became Humboldt Bay, it was always Weegi.
Weegi. And what happened when civilization came up because of the gold, search for gold?
Whose civilization?
Right, the outside civilization. Exactly.
We were a very friendly tribe. We were a friendly people. Our tribe came from Bear River to Little River, all the way into Chalk Mountain and to Berry Summit, and all names that were given after these settlers came into the area. And we were the people who were first met the Josiah Gregg Party and helped them when they were starving and nourished them and put them back on their feet. So we were pretty much a friendly group of people.
In the early days, before this whole tension started with the gold. Is that where it all started?
Yes, and Eureka was found. Chirichichi was founded and now called Eureka in 1850. Same time the state of California became a state. And in 1852 there was a big massacre over in Freshwater. In 1860 there was a big massacre on Indian Island, where we pretty much were decimated as a people.
Now, how did all of this interact with the fort and the reason the fort was here?
The fort was here to protect the Native American people from the vigilantes, and they protected us almost to death because they brought us to this area. It makes my heart feel heavy because they brought it here and they dug holes in the ground. You'll see this when you get inside one of the buildings. They have a replica of it, and where they put 200 to 300 to 400 people in at a time in the middle of February.
In holes in the ground?
In holes in the ground.
For what purpose?
To make sure that the settlers didn't get to us, I guess, to protect us from them. And there were women who were taken off in the middle of the night, who were killed and raped. There were babies who died of exposure. There were elders who died. And whatever was left after those 3 massacres in 1860, then they brought us here to protect us from the bad people. And, you know, it's being protected to death pretty much is what it was.
Well, how do you feel coming back onto this land today?
I prayed. I did my medicine this morning. I'm with my sister who gives me strength, my family, and it's okay. I made peace with that. That happened many years ago. We have to move on today, and we need to go forward, and that's what we do.
Our first building, this is one of 2 buildings reconstructed here on the old fort site. This is the old...
This was the old hospital building, yes.
Now, is this the original building?
It's been converted a few times. The original building was built in 1853, then it was rebuilt in 1866. And after the fort was abandoned, a man named W.S. Cooper bought the entire property for $6,000, and the hospital building was the only one remaining. Since that time, the city has owned the property before the state parks got the property, and the hospital building's been shifted back and forth a little bit, but this reconstruction here was done in the mid-1980s when the state parks turned this into a historical site and wanted to make this a museum.
So this is the museum now?
This is now a museum.
And I understand from reliable sources that we have a whole little welcoming committee inside the museum with some great stories to share with us. We're inside the museum, and we have hooked up with, introduce yourself to everybody.
I'm Jerry Rohde, Huell.
And you are you're one of the past presidents of the Historical Society.
Yes, I am.
So you're here to kind of explain to us what's inside this museum, because this is some pretty neat, well, this is really neat right here. What are we looking at?
We have an actual Eureka Indian canoe here, hand-carved out of an old-growth redwood, the kind that you would have seen floating on the Klamath River 150 years ago.
Back when this fort was here. This is an amazing piece of work right here.
Yeah.
Where did we get this?
Well, they would have taken a downed redwood in most cases, one that had already fallen. Once in a while, when they ran out of those, they would actually use little hand tools to chip away at a tree and drop it that way. It'd take them months to actually cut down a tree.
So this was a labor of love, and it was labor to make something like this.
Oh yeah, it was labor, and it was something that was very valuable. They would trade these canoes to other tribes that didn't have access to the redwoods, and they'd be all over this part of the state.
Now, I know there are other parts of the museum you're going to show us, but the next thing we're going to do, look in here. Look who we've got waiting for us in here. Howdy, ladies. How are you all doing? Our ladies are standing here next to a flag, and this just isn't any old flag. Who's the spokesperson for this group?
Well, I suppose I am.
Well, come on out here and let's take a look at this flag and tell us why it's so important.
Well, this is the first flag that flew over Fort Humboldt. It was raised the first time in February of 1853.
Wait a minute. This flag goes back to 1853?
Yes, it does. Doesn't it look like it?
Well, yeah, but how did it get saved? Why is it still here?
Well, the man who raised the flag the first time was a Sergeant Joseph Snedden, who came here with the Army in 1852. And after he retired, he kept the flag for many years. He stayed here in Humboldt County, and then he gave it to Mrs. Vera O'Connor Berry, a local resident. And in 1923, she gave it to the Redwood Forest chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Ah, the DAR.
Yes.
And you all have preserved it.
We have preserved the flag since 1923 when it was given to us. And in the early 90s, we started a preservation project, which took us about 5 years to raise the money to send the flag to a preservationist.
Wait a minute, this has been worked on?
Yes, it has. It's been cleaned and stabilized. So hopefully,
it must have really looked bad before.
Well, it doesn't look a lot different.
I don't mean that it looks bad now, but it looks weathered. It looks historic.
It does, because it is historic. Wow. This is the flag that flew over the fort during the time when Ulysses S. Grant was stationed here, and of course later went on to be president.
Wow,
so,
this is an amazing feat that this is still here. The fort is gone, but the flag is still here.
Right. Yes, we work very hard to keep it here too.
Well, congratulations to the DAR. You've done good work in saving the old flag.
Yeah. But it doesn't stay here all the time.
Oh, it doesn't?
No.
Where does it fly? In your backyard?
No, it stays at my house underneath the guest room bed.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not.
So this is just brought out on special occasions.
Right.
Yeah.
And Doris is currently the regent of Redwood Forest chapter. So the flag is her responsibility.
Boy, that's quite a responsibility.
It is. It very much so.
I'm sure when a guest stays in your house, they don't take off with the flag.
That's right. That's right.
Continuing our museum tour, Jerry, this is the first chance we have to actually see the configuration of the fort. Is this literally the whole fort right here?
Yeah, this is what the fort would have been like 150 years ago. It wasn't a large installation. You just had 2 companies of soldiers here. And most of the work they were doing was out in the backwoods. It was
so they weren't here at the fort.
Well, they'd send out detachments quite often.
Were these barracks over here?
Yeah, those 2 big buildings with the banisters in there are barracks.
This is the hospital we're in. And then these
officers' quarters over there, and the one closest to us down here would have been the commanding officers' quarters.
And there's the flagpole, which is still there today, and the parade ground out in the middle, and it was situated on this bluff, and basically That's it.
Yeah, you had a place here that was designed to be a fort, but there really wasn't going to be any attacks here. They didn't have to worry about fighting anywhere near the fort.
So there never was a wall around the fort like we traditionally think of as forts having.
This wasn't like Fort Apache out in the Wild West or one of those places.
Now, one of the DAR ladies mentioned Ulysses S. Grant, and that is a big people ask about that all the time here. Yeah. What role did Grant was he actually here at this fort?
He was a junior officer at the fort here in the 1850s, and people like to say that this is where he learned how to drink. It was a bad spot to be situated in those days. The weather was cloudy or rainy all the time. You had trouble going out and doing much, so he went down to the nearest place where he'd get whiskey and had a rip-roaring time. And finally, he got in so much trouble it became necessary for him to resign. And that looked like the end of his career.
Now, what year was this?
1855.
But then he went back east, I guess, and re-enlisted.
Well, first he became a shop owner and just about went bankrupt at that, and it took the Civil War to rescue his career.
Wow, so Grant's early military career was here at Fort Humboldt.
Yeah, and they used to make a big thing out of it. They'd have General Grant days here in the 1950s, and all the local guys would wear beards. And see, I still kept one all this time to honor him, so it must still be a sort of lasting tradition.
Even though he was only here...
Oh, just a few months.
Then he got out of town.
Yeah.
We end up our museum tour in this, well, this is truly, Edie, an amazing room. This is a very poignant room when you hear the story behind what this represents.
Yes, this is the corral. Now, this is just a little mini corral that we have inside. But what had happened at the fort was the conflict escalated, and then in the early 60s, 1860s that is, the regular troops had to go back east and fight in the Civil War. So the volunteers, the California volunteers took over. A lot of those people were local settlers that were very unhappy with how the military had handled the situation, and they wanted a much more vengeful answer. So
with the Native Americans.
Yes, they wanted to make sure that they got them out, away, off on reservations, killed, or whatever. And so the fort actually at that time was given the orders to take into protection, actually to take prisoner the Indians in order to protect them. And what their answer was, because there were so many of them, was to build this corral. They built it outside. It was 80 feet in diameter. There was no roof. It was completely enclosed, and they had to eat the food that the soldiers gave them. A lot of that was beef and potatoes, things they were not used to. They were exposed to a lot of diseases that they didn't have immunities for.
Oh, this was Cheryl was talking about the pits they dug for them. This would have been the same thing as the corral.
Right. This would have been the answer to try and hold 400 Indians in a space that was 80 feet in diameter. And it was just such a disaster that, fortunately, it only lasted about a month and a half. And at that time, they then put all the people that they had captured in here on boats, took them out to the Samoa Peninsula, that's the North Peninsula across the bay, where they could be just protected on one side, or guarded on one side, and have the whole peninsula to build shacks out of driftwood and to exist.
A reservation.
Until they were shipped to the reservations.
Wow.
So this was the part of the fort history that we really try, and when we're giving school group tours, try and say, this is where we have to think about what lessons can we learn from history. There is certainly
it's wonderful that you have this here to remind people, and it's very poignant just to see this corral, this wood here, and to realize what it represents.
Yes, I feel like the ancestors are standing right behind me, and it's an important lesson, and I am always amazed at how well school groups and people think about this and take it to heart.
Leaving the old hospital, we have hooked up with Gisela Rohde, who, Gisela, you've actually come up with a historic garden here. Is this like the kind of garden that might have been here at Fort Humboldt?
That's right. All of these plants were plants that would have been grown in the 1850s.
Now, how do we know that?
Well, we did, this is a master gardening project. It's a cooperative with the state parks and master gardening program, and we did extensive research, so we have verified that these are all historic plants.
Now, what would they have done with a garden here? Why would they have needed a garden? I know they would have needed a vegetable garden. Why would they have bothered? These were a bunch of old soldiers out here. Why would they have wanted any other kind of a garden?
Well, they did definitely use these plants for herbs. This is Roman chamomile. It was used for a tea. And the Santolina, the gray plant there in the corner, that was used to ward off insects.
So these were almost like the kinds of things they could have learned from the Native Americans when they were here.
Well, actually, these were plants that they would have used where they came from. And so they were used to using these plants, and so they brought them with them when they came out west.
So they brought these and planted them here in Eureka.
That's correct, because they were used to using them, and it wasn't like nowadays where you can go to the store and just buy some sort of insect repellent. They needed to use herbs because they didn't have insect repellents in a bottle.
They brought things for medicinal purposes and for cooking
also
purposes.
Culinary, like this is sage. That sage, like what you would use in a turkey dinner.
Right.
And so they had herbs for cooking and medicinal, and also for potpourris to make perfumes.
But now I'm seeing some flowers over here.
Yeah, these are some of the plants I wanted to show you how pretty they are. They not only are they useful, they also are really pretty. This is echinacea, and this was used to ward off colds. This is lady's mantle, that was used for lady problems. This is catmint, and that was used for people who were feeling nervous. You could make a tea out of it. And this is oregano, which I'm sure you know from spaghetti dinners.
Wow, so they were beautiful, but they were useful at the same time.
That's right, which is great about herbs.
And you probably get a good reaction from visitors to the fort when they come and see this little garden.
They love it. It's a bit of color, and also there's so many hummingbirds and butterflies and bees that love coming here. So it's a fun place just to sit and enjoy the garden.
It also gives you a glimpse back in time.
That's right, because these were the same. We still grow these plants nowadays, but they were growing them back in the 1850s also.
Right here in this fort.
That's right.
Well, that's it, and I almost feel guilty because when I first got here, I made comment about, you know, this was basically just a big old empty field with a couple of buildings on it, but you have shown us, and the others have shown us firsthand, that this is a very historic and a very significant place as far as California history is concerned.
It really is. There were lots of different struggles. There was lots of beginnings of things that grew to what it is today. And as a state park, our hope eventually is to replace each of these posts here, get all of the original buildings restored, and continue to let the public come in and learn a little bit of history.
A lot of important stories here. Stories about our relations with the Native Americans, good and bad. The dreams of the people who came out here to the frontier, the struggles, the hopes, the dreams, all of the things that would have been encompassed within this little fort established back in 1853.
You wouldn't imagine it, would you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we sure enjoyed having you here, and we hope that some of your viewers will come up and visit us at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park.
Boy, we will. This has been a lot of fun. At first glance, you don't see a lot here, but if you do just a little bit of digging, you find a lot of very important history that proves beyond a doubt that what you see here is not just an open field, but a fine example of one of California's golden parks. Well, this is interesting. As we were leaving the park, look what we ran into over here. Your name is?
Mike Kellogg.
Explain to us what this is all about, Mike. This has kind of caught us by surprise.
Well, this is a logging exhibit. We have a couple of steam locomotives built in 1884 and 1892 that operate up here once a month during the summer. And we have some steam donkeys that are out there that people can look at and see what it was like some time ago.
Now, this is all connected with the logging industry here in Eureka.
Yes, it is.
So you're kind of sharing, let's walk over here and take a look at this. You're kind of sharing the park with the fort. You all are all on the same grounds right here.
We are, definitely.
How long have you been here?
This exhibit, I think, has been here about 30 years.
Wow. Well, you have a lot of visitors. Is everybody, is it kind of hidden off to the side? People find it the same way we did?
Actually, we have a very loud whistle, and you can hear it almost all over town. So we have people coming up here when they hear the whistle.
Can we hear the whistle? Is the whistle ready to blow?
I'm going to hear it right now?
Yeah. One more hoot. Yeah, you can hear it all right, can't you?
Definitely can hear it.
All right, let's stand over here and take a look at it. Is this a historic engine that has any kind of ties to Eureka and to this area? I see where it was made in San Francisco.
By Marshutz and Cantrell. Actually, I think these two locomotives are the only two Marshutz and Cantrell locomotives that are still here. And it was built in 1884. It came up here by ship. It worked in Arcata for a couple of years, and that was moved down to Falk, which is just south of Eureka, and operated in the woods there until 1903.
Here we go. Well, I sure hope you enjoyed our visit way up on our state's northern coast to Fort Humboldt State Historic Park in Eureka. If you'd like to go on this adventure again or share it with family and friends, it's available on video cassette and on DVD. All you have to do is call 1-800-266-5727, and we'll be glad to send it to you right away.